All right, we are continuing on to part two of these lectures covering chapter three and food safety. And we're going to spend a lot of time on this recording to discuss the different types of bacterial, viral, and other types of microorganisms that can be in food that can make us potentially ill. Um, Bacteria is probably the most common one. And again, this is the one that gives the symptoms that you're familiar with, the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, although those are not the only symptoms that you will find. The bacteria come in either aerobic or anaerobic. Aerobic meaning that they need oxygen to survive, and anaerobic meaning they do not. So, depending on what kind of bacteria they could either need oxygen or not need oxygen. They could be thermophilic, which means they like heat. And so, if we're talking about those kinds of bacteria and we're trying to cook a food, sometimes we have to cook it to an even higher temperature because the bacteria won't be killed at certain temperatures. And then cryophilic are those that really love cold temperatures. So those are the ones that we can put the food in the refrigerator or the freezer and the bacteria will be preserved and it will not kill that bacteria. Molds are another common type of microorganism that we find in food, and you've seen these. You've seen it on bread, you've seen it on um, fruits or vegetables when you leave them out, and this is a very common type of organism. Now, sometimes they're not harmful, but they can be, and so you have to be very careful what kinds of foods that you get into. Some of them actually do release some sort of toxin, which can be very, very hazardous and poisonous to people. And it's very few that do this, but they can do that. And certain ones, that are in, there's one called aflatoxin, which is in moldy peanuts. And so those can actually cause some really serious problems, but not as much in the United States. And then we'll also briefly talk about some viruses that can be found. Now, these are typically things that are found in foods because of people. So maybe you didn't wash your hands very well when you were preparing food and transmit the virus from the food to the next host person. And the food doesn't necessarily grow the virus, but it can transport the virus. So it's very important to prevent because most of these bacteria, viruses, molds occur because we didn't do a good job of killing the food during cooking or storing or preparing. And so it's very important that we follow all those steps, especially in lab where we're trying to keep people not getting sick. People can be more at risk. There are certain populations of people that are more at risk for bacteria, infants and children because their immune system is not mature yet. The older adults that you may be working with or living with, just because their immune system can be sometimes compromised. HIV and AIDS, cancer patients, all of those people have a lower or weaker immune system, and so they may not be able to handle the infection as well or the foodborne illness, and they may have more severe symptoms and even death. So with bacterial poisoning, we're going to talk about several, and I have little pictures of them up on the slides as well, so you can kind of see what the little buggies look like. Salmonella is probably the most common. It's the one that's going to cause the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea that you think of most often when you think of foodborne illnesses. And when you get the GI illness, the symptoms, it's called salmonellosis. And it really can occur very quickly. On average, it's about 12 hours, but it can occur as early as 6 and it can occur as late as 72 hours after you eat the infected food. The most common types of foods are pork, poultry, and eggs, but those aren't the only ones. And you have to be careful with this one because frozen storage doesn't really kill this bacteria. You really have to cook it to a high enough temperature for a certain period of time in order to kill these bacteria. Yersinia, Yersiniosis is typically something that you're going to find in raw milk or pork. Now, this one, if you've ever heard of the bubonic plague that happened, was it the Dark Ages? Actually was spread by rats at that time. The rats would transfer this bacteria from the food, but this is another serious illness that can cause some nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And you want to make sure that you avoid any sort of unpasteurized milk or make sure that you cook your pork well. Clostridium perfringens. Now, there are going to be two Clostridium bacteria that we're going to talk about. The perfringens is the first one. This one is typically found in meats and meat dishes, and it creates spores. And so you want to make sure that you don't store meat at room temperature at any point in time, and that when you're cooking meats that you cook it to the right temperature. This one also is when we have to be careful about storing leftovers. Typically you don't want to keep leftovers over 3 days, because after that point you can have a high risk of these types of infections. And symptoms can be nausea, it can be vomiting, some diarrhea, but you're literally more likely to see the nausea associated with this one. Staph. So staph infection is a really common um, food worker spread infection. So meaning people who don't wash their hands very well after using the bathroom or touching another part of their body that's contaminated. So it's real easy to transfer this one. The symptoms usually occur within the first 3 to 8 hours after you eat the infected food, and they can last for several days. And it creates kind of this weird toxin. So if you even were to get staph that is put on food, you have to cook it for such a high temperature for so long that it's really kind of pointless. So really prevention is the most important thing here, because once the food gets infected, you're pretty much going to give it to somebody. There are some foods that are more high risk. These things can be ham, certain creamed foods, so like creamed soups, cream of tomato, other types of milk-based foods, poultry, cream pies, like if you ever had a key lime pie or a mud pie, those types of things. And milks and cheeses also have a high risk of carrying this staphylococcal bacteria. Vibrio cholerae. So this is one that's transmitted by people as well, because they may not wash their hands very well after using the restroom. It is the bacteria that's responsible for cholera, and cholera creates really severe dehydration through extreme diarrhea, and in some cases, if it's not taken care of very quickly and the dehydration continues, it can lead to death. There are some other forms of the Vibrio that are not the cholerae bacteria that can be found in seafood, but it's typically in raw seafood, which is one of the reasons that you have to be careful when you eat sushi. Clostridium. Here's our other bacteria from the Clostridium family. This is the botulinum bacteria. And this one really is a heat-loving bacteria. And so it's very, very common in canned foods, especially those that are low acid, like vegetables, meats, poultry, fish. So anytime you have somebody that's canning any sort of vegetable, they have to make sure that they cook it at a really high temperature for a really pretty long period of time to kill this bacteria. Because if you were to consume something that had this botulinum bacteria in there, the likelihood of death is very, very high. In fact, 2/3 of people who are infected will die, especially those in our high-risk groups like older adults, children, and people with chronic illnesses. And the symptoms of this one are very different, because this bacteria affects the nervous system and the respiratory system. So you will have some paralysis. You may have difficulty breathing, and it can get so severe that a lot of times you have people that have significant long-term effects, and it takes a really long time to kind of recover if you do survive this illness. So you want to be careful when you're purchasing any canned goods, or if you're canning at home. You know, if you're buying canned goods, you want to make sure that the cans are not bulging out, that there's no dents, that there's no kind of curved edges to it at all, because that can allow that bacteria to grow in that environment. Listeria. Listeria is one of those cold-loving bacteria. And so if you were to freeze or keep these types of foods in the refrigerator, it's not going to kill the bug. It's actually just going to make it really happy. And one of the ways, or one of the foods that you get this in, is deli meat, because of the way that the animals have been raised. So farm animals can come in contact with this bacteria, and even during the slaughter process or the packaging process, it can maintain alive, because during all those times, you know, the food packaging is kept cold so the bacteria can survive. So to avoid this contamination, you want to make sure all your milk is pasteurized, all your dairy foods are pasteurized, which we'll talk about later on. You can separate your raw and cooked foods, which you should always do, and we'll talk a lot about that in the next recording. Keeping cutting boards and equipment clean, washing all raw food before eating, that's fruits and vegetables. We'll talk about the temperature danger zone. And then again, making sure that your meat, fish, poultry is all cooked to the correct temperature will help prevent this bacteria. Campylobacter jejuni can be found in the intestinal tract of meat and poultry. So that means that it can continue once they slaughter the animal. It can be still within the food. It can also be in unpasteurized milk or raw and undercooked meats. So you have to make sure that you heat the food to the appropriate temperature, and we'll talk about this a lot, but at least 160 for a lot of these meats is going to be what kills these bacteria. E. coli. So E. coli we have naturally in our colon, and it's something that we have, but we manage it, and it's there to have some health benefits, which we won't cover very much in this class. But there's two main types of Escherichia coli that we're going to talk about. The first one has to do with a specific type of E. coli, and this one can be enteroinvasive or enterotoxigenic. So enteroinvasive is typically something that you get. It stays inside and it lives and it's happy and healthy. That's the one that we're used to in our GI tract. But then you have enterotoxigenic. Sorry, these words are sometimes hard to say. But this is the one that you get when you eat food contaminated with E. coli, or they sometimes call it traveler's diarrhea. And this is one of those reasons you don't drink the water in foreign countries a lot of times. And this one is usually from people not washing their hands very well or from contaminated water and food supplies. The other one, the E. coli O157H7, is an enterohemorrhagic type of E. coli. And that is because it significantly destroys the internal organs of the body. So it can cause bloody diarrhea. In real severe cases, it may cause kidney failure. And it's really become kind of media friendly because it has caused significant deaths due to people consuming undercooked ground beef or even raw milk. And then there was a scare, I want to say about 10 years ago, where they found E. coli on spinach because of the runoff that went to the spinach farms contaminating the spinach leaves. So this one you may have heard of because it pops up on the news quite a bit. Shigella. So Shigella is a type of bacteria that can sometimes cause dysentery, meaning it can cause diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. And this, again, is because people have not washed their hands appropriately. And you get this sometimes from contaminated water, which is why most public water supplies and some bottled water companies use specific things like chlorine and other types of ozone is another type of cleanser for the water to kill any sort of bacteria that might be living within that water supply. Now, just briefly going through some viral poisoning, the two biggest ones that you're going to find are hepatitis A and norovirus. Both of them are because people have not washed their hands appropriately or have worked and handled food when they are ill and can pass the virus from the food to the person after they ingest the food. And the norovirus can cause significant nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Hepatitis A is usually can kind of stay dormant for a long time before you even know that you are sick and have the symptoms. And then finally, parasites. These are things that can actually live inside us and can live inside the meats that we eat. The biggest one that they find some of these on are in pork, which trichinosis is one of the most common ones that we find. And this one is the one that you hear if you ingest it. It goes straight to the brain and can destroy the brain tissue. And the larvae can live in the body for up to 10 years before you have any sort of symptoms, which is really kind of creepy if you think about it. Other worms you can ingest are other protozoa, which can cause symptoms. So make sure you're washing and keeping your hands very, very clean.